Joining me right now is our resident historian. We've actually had him come on during the 100th anniversary or the commemoration of the most deadly virus to ever attack us. His book is called More Deadly Than War because this Spanish flu took out more people than World War One. And joining me right now, Kenneth C. Davis. Welcome to the Karen Hunter Show. Welcome.
Thank you, Karen. A pleasure as always. And it took out more people than World War One, World War Two, Korea, and Vietnam War combined. When we speak about Americans, just Americans, 675,000 Americans died of basically the flu and its complications, but that was in a little more than a year. We're talking about a number that's equal to people who have died from HIV and AIDS in 40 years, just to give you some sense of the magnitude of this. So I just want to say, first of all, I listened to your previous guest. You had great information. You're doing a great service. And right now, we really have to be concerned with good information because that was one of the lessons of the Spanish flu. There was a lot of propaganda. There was censorship and outright lies, and those led to more people dying.
And that was during a time when we didn't have the vast social media outlet. We didn't have all of the connected ways in which we can communicate across the globe like we can today. And yet here we are still with misinformation, propaganda, and lies. So I'm not here for any of it, which is why I want you to help us out with the history of this. So the Spanish flu originated where and how did it spread and how quickly did it spread and then how did it end?
Right. Let me start with the obvious. First of all, it did not start in Spain. The fact is that whenever we talk about the Spanish flu, back then they called it the Great Flu. There were other names for it. The Spanish flu got attached to it because it was coming during the midst of World War One, which had started in August of 1914. The United States didn't get involved until 1917, and the first troops weren't actually going to Europe until around this time, springtime in March and April of 1918. The Spain was not fighting in the war. It was a neutral nation. So it did not censor its newspapers. And the first report of a massive epidemic in any European city came out of Madrid. And the King of Spain was actually sick, and they shut down the streetcars, did social distancing 100 years ago, in a sense. But because this first report came from Spain, it was widely known as the Spanish flu. The Spaniards called it the Naples soldier. In Germany, they called it the Bolshevik disease. So every country had its own name for it, but a lot of people have come down to call it the Spanish flu. We now know it was a avian flu that probably originated in Asia. If it was China, no one can say with certainty. They didn't have the tests and the science back then to determine this. In fact, they hadn't even seen a virus in 1918. People knew about bacteria. Bacteria are large enough to be seen by a regular microscope. A virus is infinitely smaller than a bacteria, and no one saw a virus. They didn't really know what it was. They had the word virus. It had been around for a while. They had the word influenza. That goes back for 2,000 years to ancient Greece. But the idea of something this small, this invisible, wreaking this much havoc was just something they didn't understand yet. The start of the Spanish flu in the United States is usually traced to Kansas, even though it may have been in other places. And again, we don't know all the answers to this, but it was at an army base, and that's again the connection to World War One. All of a sudden, you had millions of young men being put in army bases spread all over the country, and they were crowded into barracks. We didn't have an army at the time in 1917. We had to go from about 100,000 men to 4 million men, 0 to 60 in a very short amount of time. So all these guys are crowded together in barracks and tents. The flu starts around them. They then get on trains and go to other bases. They get onto trains and go to ports and get on ships and go to Europe. By May of 1918, a million doughboys, as they were called, U.S. soldiers, had landed in France, and that was like the explosion started. You could see almost from this one port in France the spread, and it eventually went across Europe and ultimately all around the world, killing between 50 and 100 million people. Those are estimates. That's a big estimate. So
A
this
third
was
of the population, I read. A third of the population.
this. There are a lot of estimates that are all over the place. The number I see, we're hearing a lot of people talk about fatality rate or mortality rate for this influenza and its related problems. The mortality rate is thought to be around 2%. We still don't know what it will be for the coronavirus because we don't really have a solid handle on the numbers yet. But if it's at that level, you can just imagine then what we're talking about. The United States population in 1918 was a little over 100 million. We're over 300 million now, so 3 times the population. Just do the math if we got to something that bad. Now, I do not want to say that this.
Oh no. Did he break? Brittany? Is he gone? Oh. Hello?
Yes, I'm still here.
All right, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay.
So you said 2%. You don't want to say, because right now the mortality or fatality rate of this is 3% globally.
Right. We just don't know those numbers yet. The other thing that we really don't know yet, and this is an important part of the history of the Spanish flu, it started clearly in March, April, probably in February. There were some early reports in rural Kansas of a strange influenza in late February. So just around the same time of year as this has started, the Spanish flu started. It went way up and then seemed to recede a little bit. And we've heard people talking about that, the seasonality of this. The big difference that we don't know what will happen is that the Spanish flu came back in the fall, and it came back more virulent, more violent, more deadly than it was the first time around. And the real second wave of the great influenza was the most deadly aspect of this. And again, it was going on while the largest military offensive in history was taking place in Europe, something called the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were fighting, and most of American deaths from the war happened in a few weeks' time in Europe as this was going on back in the United States and around the world. The stories are dreadful. The book that I wrote about this is called More Deadly Than War because it truly was. But you hear people talk time and time again about bodies being stacked like cordwood. They just couldn't keep up with the number of bodies, especially in the Army bases. A doctor in Bellevue in New York City said the people are coming in, they're turning blue as huckleberries and dropping dead. Now, the reason he said they're turning blue as huckleberries is that when your lungs are filling up with fluid and you don't get enough oxygen, your body starts to turn blue. It's called cyanosis. And that, or being cyanotic. And that is why, before they called it the Spanish flu, many people called this the Purple Death. And because of the war and globalization, I mean, the World War I is the first global war, this thing spread around the entire world. So a British supply ship that stops in India with some infected crew, those men get off the boat. India, the port in what is now called Mumbai, used to be Bombay, was infected. Those people got on trains and took it across India. Maybe 20 million Indians died from the Spanish flu. So this was a dreadful thing, very, very violent, very, very contagious, and spread because of globalization.
Which we now are on airplanes. Flying everywhere hither and yon, and here we go, right? So from China to Italy to France to, now we're here. And so you said initially people died and then it tapered off. So there was a sense that it had blown over, and then it came back in the fall with a vengeance.
Right, and that's what a lot of doctors and virologists, epidemiologists, historians of this are saying. we don't know what happens in the fall. We've had lots of people talking about how this is going to go away soon, including some very, very prominent people
Right.
who don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
And that's where the danger of ignorance and ignoring sound medical advice come into this story. That was one of the big problems in 1918. The president at that time, Woodrow Wilson, was much more concerned with fighting the war than he was with fighting the flu virus, even though the flu eventually killed many more people. So they were told, for instance, don't put any more soldiers on the ships to go over to Europe. Hold back. Quarantine the army bases. Stop the draft. It was a wartime draft then. And actually, one man did stop the draft briefly. He didn't have the authority to do it, but he just did it. And Wilson and the commander in Europe at the time, General Pershing, just wanted to keep the troops coming. They had the Germans almost defeated. They wanted to make a final push to get to to defeat Germany, and of course that does happen on November 11th in 1918, which becomes Armistice Day, the day the guns fall silent. Now we mark it as Veterans Day, of course. But while the war is being fought, the death is just mounting. One of the most grievous stories, and I talked about this a lot last week because I could not believe that they were considering having the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York City. In Philadelphia in 1918, they had a parade to sell war bonds. That was a big deal back in World War I. People would go out into the streets to sell these, what they were called Liberty Loans. That was the way they paid for the war. It was more than just a parade. This was pride and patriotism, and if you weren't participating and if you weren't buying those bonds, you were a slacker. You weren't doing your part. So they had, even though they knew that the flu was around, it was already in the Army bases and Navy Yard in Philadelphia, they let this parade go on. 200,000 people crowd the streets of Philadelphia, September 28th, 1918. 2 days later, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was filled. The contrast to Philadelphia was the city of St. Louis, where the health department said they saw what was coming. They had seen it in Boston. They saw it in Philadelphia. They shut everything down. They practiced what we now know as social distancing, quarantine, and the death rate in St. Louis, it was historically much, much lower than it was in Philadelphia, where they closed things down after it was already too late.
Okay, so we can learn a lot from history. So when did the Spanish flu, because it lasted for almost 2 years, when did it go away, and did it just go away mysteriously, or was there some medical miracle that came and saved the day?
There was no medical miracle in 1918. Again, medicine was very, very, in a way, primitive then. Of course, they knew a lot more. There were vaccines for certain things, but only things that were bacterial in nature primarily. There was no vaccine for anything that was a virus, and we still don't have a flu cure. We have flu vaccines. They didn't come until the 1940s. So there was no medical miracle. What essentially happened is that, as it's described by many writers and historians of this, that the Spanish flu had basically used up all the fuel. And then and the seasonality did eventually take over. But it went all through 1918, went into 1919. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, who was the president, was in Paris negotiating the peace treaty, and he got the flu. They thought he might have been poisoned. He was so sick.
Wow.
And he survived. There has been some question historically as to whether the flu affected his judgment, his reasoning, his willpower, because there were decisions he made at that peace treaty, the Versailles Peace Treaty, that really contradicted things he said he was going to do. And of course, that treaty had enormous ramifications for what was going to happen in history afterwards. Most people thought, well, this is the peace that will end the war to end all wars. That's what they believed back then. Others said, we'll have another war like this in 25 years. They were wrong. It only took 20 years from 1919 to 1939 because there had been so many bad judgments made in 1919.
So elections matter as well, and having leadership that's coherent and competent, that also matters. So the people who survived the Spanish flu were people who adhered to not being around other people and and who practiced good hygiene habits and stayed away from others.
Absolutely. All the things that you're hearing today, they understood then for the most part and tried to do it. And, it was just too overwhelming, especially in crowded cities. In New York City, for instance, the tenements of the Lower East Side where people, talked about the carts coming around like it was the Middle Ages of the Black Death and picking up the dead bodies. So, yes, quarantine, taking good care of yourself, and nursing was such an important thing. And in fact, the nursing profession really opened up to women because of the Spanish flu and the war. They needed more nurses. Up until that time, women weren't supposed to be nurses. They might see a naked man. So, but that really changed. There's also a story I tell in More Deadly Than War, how the Army was so desperate for nurses, they actually allowed some African American nurses to treat white soldiers, and that was a big step forward. It's astonishing to think back and look back at what this part of our history was like. But so that was a step forward for these women who were on the front lines of this war back then, and still had to confront the racism and segregation of the United States Army.
Kenneth C. Davis, More Deadly Than War. What do you want us to leave reading this book? And since we have time, we have time to read it. We're going to give you a link to it. You can download it. You can get the audio version. It's very well done as well. What do you want us to leave with? Understanding.
Like your previous guest who was, I was listening, and he was a source of good information, and you, I'm sure, are as well. Everyone should be listening to the best possible information. The CDC hasn't been perfect in these past few weeks, but the CDC.gov website has some very, very good basic information for self-sanitation, taking care of yourself, hand washing. It sounds so almost simplistic, but it really makes a huge difference. Yes, cover your, so all the practical parts of that. But I guess the real important point is find good, reliable sources of information. Take this very seriously. I do not know where this is going. I don't think anyone does. We certainly don't want the numbers that we had proportionally in 1918, obviously, but right now it's looking kind of grim, let alone the economic havoc that this is going to bring on this country and the world in the next few weeks and months.
Well, we're going to talk about that, but I want to thank you for always being available, for being a part of our family since the beginning, as a matter of fact. And I just am so grateful that you are our resident historian, Kenneth C. Davis. Thank you so much for being here.
One other very quick important point, Karen.
Yes.
In 1918, there was an election. People voted. It was a midterm election, but people still went and voted, and around the same numbers as usually. But we have to make sure that we guarantee that everyone's going to go and vote either in the primaries and certainly next November. That's going to be so important in the midst of this crisis. Do
not let fear keep you from the polls. Do not let your elected officials keep you from the polls, is what's happening in Georgia right now with Brian Kemp attempting to stop people from voting and wanting to actually select the people to sit in these seats. I think there's a couple of judge races that they want to call off and let him select. No. We have to. That's our right. And we cannot let this fear take away our rights. Not again. Not like we did during 9/11. Let's not do that. So thank you for the reminder, Kenneth C. Davis. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Karen. It's always a great pleasure to be with you, and I hope to see you in person soon.
You will.